Sometimes there are days where I can sit down and crank out like 3 to 4 episodes in a row. I don't have to restart. There's no issues. It's just this seamless, beautiful process. Today is not one of those days. I've restarted this episode. I think this is the 4th time. So hopefully 4th time is the charm. I don't know what's up with me today. I'm chatty, but like not in the way that I need to be. Like I just want to sit here and bullshit on camera. But that's not what we're here to do today. We're here to talk about research and self-control. And I'm here to help you, not just like talk about random things that are going on in my life. And that's how the last 3 takes have started. And I was just like, Kasey, this is ridiculous. We need to cut to the chase here. It's funny because I feel like I have gotten very, very good when it comes to writing, whether it be like copywriting, Instagram captions, sales pages, emails, whatever, becoming much more concise with what I want to say. And then sometimes I come on here and I'm just like yapping away about things that are so unnecessary for you to hear. So anyway, we're cutting to the chase for the 4th time here, trying for the 4th time to cut to the chase, I should say. Okay. Self-control research, guys. I have talked about self-control a lot on this podcast, and I think that makes a lot of sense because I talk a lot about mindset and behavior change, especially when it comes to health and fitness behavior change, health and fitness coaching for behavior change, because self-control at least seems to be somewhat required if you're wanting to change your behavior, sustain that behavior change over time. So I have not gone this direction yet with an episode, and I feel like it's very necessary given how much we do talk about self-control. And the self-control research has, I want to use the word changed, but it's not really that it's changing, it's just getting updated. And this is how science works, right? Just because one paper comes out and says something in one direction, another paper could come out and say it in a different direction. And then now we go, oh, that's interesting. What does that mean? How can we figure out what these differences are and what is the truth, or at least closer to the truth, right? Like, because science doesn't actually ever prove anything. And fun fact, if you're talking about science or you're talking about research results, you really should not use the word prove, because we're never actually proving anything. We are just gaining more evidence to support a certain hypothesis. Can I sound any more like an academic? So just keep that in mind. Honestly, that's just like a quick tip. Anytime you're talking about research, writing about research, you're throwing it in an Instagram caption, whatever, please don't use the word prove, because that's not how science works. We are just continuously uncovering evidence and trying to create a clearer picture of what is going on, especially in psychology, because man, humans are messy creatures. They're messy creatures, and it is nearly impossible to say that we know for a fact that something goes this way, right? We're not as direct and clear as like a math equation might be, or like physics, right? So on that note, self-control research has gone different directions in the last decade, to the point where this was a few years ago now at this point, I had to update the self-control module inside the health mindset coaching certification and make it a little bit more clear that this is now, the current updated information that we know about self-control. And originally it was thought that self-control gets depleted as you use it. There's actually a theory. It's called ego depletion theory. So if you wanted to pop into Google Scholar, you could type in ego depletion theory, and tons of studies are going to come up about how self-control gets depleted as you use it. However, that has very much been called into question in the last decade or so, 5 to 10 years. And replication of those studies that showcase that has been difficult. So to the point where it's not really something that's taught very much anymore. I was actually speaking to my PhD advisor Shout out Dr. Jenny Burnett. We were talking about this and I was asking her some questions along the lines of how she teaches this stuff now, because she teaches social psychology courses at NC State. And she said that they don't really talk about ego depletion anymore, that that's not the way that things are described when we're talking about self-control, because of this, like, we're not really sure that this ego depletion theory thing is really that valid anymore based on more recent research. So we're not really sure that that's how self-control works, that it gets depleted throughout the day as you use it, type of thing. And what's come to be maybe a more accurate depiction of self-control is that it's just so much more nuanced. And some people may fall prey to that ego depletion theory, that your self-control gets depleted. Others might not. And there's just other variables that need to be considered, like big surprise, right? Humans are complex creatures. So in this episode, I'm focusing on describing what differences actually seem to exist between those who have high self-control and those that don't, with the intention for you to then like leverage this information for yourself, for your clients in your coaching practices, for those of you that are coaches. And I'm going to be going over a bunch of tidbits of information that are all supported by research studies. The citations for those studies are going to be tossed into the show notes as well. So if you wanted to go like dive a little bit deeper into those, you certainly can. So first things first. Research does suggest that having higher self-control is helpful. And you may have heard this and been like, okay, Kasey, if that's the type of research we're talking about in this episode today, I'm just gonna tune out and catch you next time, because duh, right? Duh. Self-control is helpful. And the research, though, supports, like, hang with me, okay? Give me a second. Supports that those with high self-control do better in school, have better relationships, less binge eating episodes and substance abuse. We also see less mental health problems. So those are some pretty big markers, right? And I think this is interesting too, because there is a narrative that exists. And I think you guys will all understand this, especially if you are in the health and fitness coaching space, that people with high self-control are like boring. You know, the classic, you just need to live a little type of phrases get tossed at them. This is something that our clients experience a lot. And you've probably heard when working with clients that this high self-control, like white knuckling your way through things a lot of the time, is synonymous with like being stuck up, the inability to let loose, like you're no fun type of thing. And sometimes it might not even be that our clients or like you yourself are hearing this from people around you, but you're actually thinking that about yourself. Like, I'm going to be seen as no fun. I'm going to be seen as someone that nobody wants to hang out with, because I am trying to exert self-control, resist temptation when maybe everybody else is not, right? However, research points in a different direction, that high self-control actually leads to more likelihood of someone feeling better in the moment, and also just having more satisfaction with life in general. So as much as it can seem like, oh, like having high self-control, needing to exert self-control, whatever, leads to someone being like grumpy, crabby, not having any fun, they can't let loose, no one wants to hang out with them. The research that I'm looking at here doesn't really support that narrative, right? Which can be really helpful from a mindset perspective. Of course, I'm going to go there, because if you believe that self-control, having high self-control, having the ability to exert self-control, however you want to look at it, if you believe that that actually adds to your life, that's a good thing, then the chances of you being able to do it are much higher, because you believe that there's going to be positive outcomes for you, that is something that is valuable to you, versus thinking like, oh, this is going to make me look bad, I'm not going to have any friends, spiraling in that direction, and having maybe more of a fixed mindset about like what self-control can do for you, like it's going to be bad, it's not going to be helpful, whatever, then chances of you actually doing it and being able to use self-control probably pretty low because you don't see the value in it, right? So we love this research that says, at least supports, that high self-control equals positive outcomes, right? So that said, something that was recently discussed, it's kind of interesting, I wanted to bring up here on, I can't remember if it was Health Mindset Coaching Certification. This is the certification program that I run for health and fitness professionals. I have a level 1 and a level 2. And right now, both of them are in session. So it is hard for me to remember if the conversations were being held in a level 1 call or a level 2 call. But regardless, someone had asked about the differences between willpower, self-control, self-discipline, like these words, right? And if they are essentially just the same exact thing. And so we had that discussion, and one of the main takeaways that I wanted everyone to take away was that the definition that someone holds for each of those words is far more important than whether or not we are deciding as like a group in the health mindset coaching certification if they're synonymous, right? So if you have a client who uses the word willpower versus a client who uses the word self-control, maybe noticing like the difference between what those mean to those people, or maybe you have one client who sometimes uses one word versus the other depending on certain circumstances and context, like pay attention to that because that will tell you a lot. But one thing I wanted to note is like across all of these different words, self-discipline, self-control, willpower, they all imply effort, right? So again, although those definitions may vary depending on the person, it seems like there's effort involved, like willpower, self-discipline, self-control, right? This is all like effortful type of language. And maybe you don't agree with me. Maybe you're like, no, I don't actually see that to be the case. Because again, everyone's perceptions, it's never really just like semantics because everyone sees words differently and has their own definitions and what have you. But the truth is, people who are actually good at self-control are not actually using a lot of effort at all. And that is what I want to really get into inside this episode, and how this belief that self-control equals effortful is actually something we really need to unpack, because those who are quote unquote actually good at self-control have this like effortless edge, and that is what allows them to continue to be successful, avoid temptation. And there's a difference between resist and avoid temptation. We'll get into that too. Okay, we're going to start with this study. It was on 200 people. The study was out of Germany. Again, if you're looking to dive into this further, there will be a citation in the show notes for you to grab. And these people were firstly assessed on their level of self-control. And researchers assessed this. It was self-report type of data, right? So it was a sit down, answer these questions, and we're going to use that to assess how quote unquote good you are at self-control. And this was a measure of trait self-control, which is important to note because trait self-control is different than state self-control. And this is generally like trait versus state. This is like something good to know. Trait being more like personality characteristics versus state being more like temporary condition, right? So they were measuring trait self-control. Like, are you high or low in trait self-control? So like your actual like characteristics about yourself, right? So that's how the study started. They assessed those things. And then these 200 people wore little devices that sent them pings throughout the day. And when those pings came through, those people were asked a series of questions related to whether or not in that moment they were currently or recently desiring something, and asked a few more questions about that desire. You know, who are you around? What does that look like? What is that thing that you're desiring, etc. And at each of these time points, the goal was to essentially see, like, are you in a situation, or were you recently in a situation where you had to use self-control, or you were prompted to resist temptation, right? That was kind of like the goal of this, and to track that throughout the day in real time as people were just living their lives in Germany. And a lot of the findings from this study are not super surprising. So, first off, 50% of the time when these 200 people were pinged and required to reflect on whether or not they desire something, 50% of the time when they were pinged, they were desiring something. There was something that they desired in that moment or recently. And the most common desires that they had were things like wanting to eat, wanting to sleep, wanting to drink, use social media, have leisure time, like relax, or some kind of like social contact is what they were desiring when that was being pinged. So this is super interesting. I'd actually now I'm like, I want to kind of do this with myself. Like many times throughout the day, have like a little alarm that goes off that reminds me to think like, are you like craving anything right now? Do you desire anything right now? And see what comes up and how often that's actually happening. For these 200 people, it was 50% of the time. And when participants, the people in this study, use self-control, they were able to resist whatever that desire was 80% of the time, which is like pretty solid, I feel like, right? I'm not sure that I would have guessed that high. That in general, 80% of the time when someone is faced with something that they desire that maybe they don't really want to do, or it's not like serving their best interest, whatever, donuts in the break room type of situation, 80% of the time they are able to resist it. That's actually like, it's pretty solid. I mean, that's a solid B, So there was an interesting finding, though, that I want to share with you guys. Those who scored high on trait self-control, remember they did that at the beginning before we went into this experiment, they didn't actually have less desires than those who were comparing them to. So, those that had maybe lower trait self-control. So it wasn't that there was a difference in number of desires. So this is essentially saying, like, per this one study, right, that people who are high in trait self-control, they are not like going about their day feeling like I have less desire to eat, to drink, to see someone, to take a break, to whatever. So they noticed that. But, and this is a big but, compared to those other people with lower trait self-control, those with high trait self-control had less issue when those desires arose. Okay. So they reported having less conflict when they had those desires. So that essentially means they had less temptation to give into those desires. So same amount of desires, but less feeling of like temptation and like, oh my gosh, this is difficult, like lots of friction, like it's hard for me to say no type of thing. So I have a quote actually from the researchers. They said, people with high levels of trait self-control are good at avoiding temptation, not resisting it. I'm going to say that again because I feel like it's really important. People with high levels of trait self-control are good at avoiding temptation, not resisting it. So the key words here, and I kind of alluded to this previously, is the difference between avoid and resist, which then brings us back to this idea of effort, which I talked about at the beginning too. If you can avoid something, avoid even putting yourself in the situation in the first place, that is a lot less effort, still some effort required, right? A lot less, though, than having to be in the situation and then resist the temptation. That's a lot more effort, right? So we're starting to see kind of this like through line, connect the dots type of situation here related to those who are quote unquote high in trait self-control. And I'm saying it in quotes because we'll get into that later. I'm not going to start that conversation now. Quote unquote high in state or trait self-control. Oh my gosh, now I'm like tripping over my own words. We're seeing those people high in self-control are better at avoiding situations where they would have to use self-control. So then here's what I was kind of getting at. That begs the question, is it really that they're good at self-control? Or is it that they have this other ability, which I don't know what we want to name this, just ability to avoid situations of temptation so they don't ever have to resist temptation? You feel me? You following? You picking up what I'm putting down? I hope so, because that felt a little circular and confusing even for me. Okay, that said though, there was another study that kind of tested this idea of the difference between avoiding versus resisting temptation. And in this study, researchers found that the people who scored high on trait self-control, so we're like holding on to that still, reported also more often using strategies to minimize or avoid temptation. So they're seeing the same thing again. There's a relationship between the people who are high in self-control and the people who are most frequently minimizing or reducing the amount of times that you're having to even use self-control. That's essentially what's being found here. And those people were more likely to choose to like set up their work environments in a way that avoided distractions, for example, versus needing to use self-control to resist the temptation of distraction. So again, it just like begs the question, are people who are good at self-control really good at self-control, or are they just good at avoiding it? It's like, that's really the question. And something else I want to include here too is just a quick chat about habits, because we know that when something is habitual, it's less effortful, right? It's somewhat automatic for us. So perhaps there's a link here between the less effortful direction that people who are high in self-control typically take and habits, which are less effortful in it of themselves. I also apologize. I'm getting over a cold. And I feel like every once in a while I sound a little nasally, so I'm sorry for that. And to tie in this kind of like habit hypothesis, we'll call it, there was a 2021 meta-analysis, and I know I've mentioned this before, but for the sake of reminding, a meta-analysis is essentially a study on a bunch of studies. So it's like, let's pull together a bunch of high-quality studies and see, based on all of these different studies on a similar topic, what we can glean from that versus just looking at one study, right? So this was a study of a bunch of studies. Researchers did, in fact, find a relationship between high trait self-control and habits. So high trait self-control is actually associated with more automatic behaviors compared to the more consciously controlled type of behaviors. And some of the study results that were included in this meta-analysis that support this idea is essentially people who are high in trait self-control mention weaker, unhealthy snacking habits. So they snack unhealthfully less often. They have stronger exercise habits and also stronger meditation habits. And this was based on a study looking at a 3-month meditation retreat. 3 months after a meditation retreat, not a 3-month retreat, but they were looking at meditation habits after this retreat. And that was related to those who have high trait self-control. People had stronger meditation habits. So, which is really cool, because obviously on this podcast, we talk a lot about health and fitness behavior. So meditation, snacking, exercise, if we can see that there's a connection between those types of habitual actions and someone who is high in trait self-control, then it becomes, for us as health and fitness coaches, or us for ourselves, it's like, okay, cool. If that's the case, then really this underlying mechanism is high trait self-control. So how do we improve that, right? We can look at that as like the mechanism for healthy habits, which is really cool. So quoting the research on this too, by relying on stable habits and routines, individuals with better self-control can enact important behaviors more automatically and more effortlessly. So there is this like intimate tie between habits and high trait self-control. And the link, the similarity between the two seems to be this like lower effort, more automatic process, right? So again, another thing that could potentially help help someone have higher trait self-control would be to help them build healthier habits. So you can see here how there's maybe just like this synergistic effect between high trait self-control and healthy habits, right? So really working on one, or hopefully you're working on both of them, really. They will help each other out. And that will just kind of like continue to snowball into this really good, healthy situation. So I feel like in general, the goal, the old goal, we will call it, has historically been to increase self-control. Like I want to increase self-control and get better at self-control. I want to get better at resisting temptation. But really based on this research, the goal we should be shooting for is to reduce the need for effortful self-control in the first place, so that you aren't ever even presented with the need to resist temptation. So rather than trying to figure out the best way to like white knuckle your way through situations or whatever, the thing you should really be doing is just not putting yourself in those situations in the first place. Easier said than done a lot of the time, right? But this is where, as a coach, or if you're listening to this for yourself, really start to think more about your environments, your habits, the people that you're around, and just how often you're actually putting yourself in a situation where you have to exert self-control. You have to resist temptation. And is there a way that you could maybe reduce that a little bit? And by doing so, you may notice, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm getting so much better at self-control, right? So really, really, to wrap all of this up, what we're trying to do here is stop trying to resist temptation and instead work on avoiding it. Because the people who are actually good at self-control are the ones setting up their environment and their habits to not have to use self-control in the first place. I hope this was helpful. I hope running through some of these research studies was interesting to you and there were some good takeaways. As always, I'm open to any feedback, any questions that you have. If there's something that you would love to hear more on, please let me know and I can maybe slot that for a future episode. I love getting ideas from you guys, so please don't hesitate to reach out and please don't hesitate to leave a review. If you enjoyed this episode, we choose new winners every single month to get a free workshop from me. You have to leave the review and screenshot the review and put it into the review form, because otherwise there's no way for us to find you, contact you, and give you your prize. And you'll see the link to that form in the show notes as well. Okay, my friends, gonna wrap it up there. Thank you so much for spending some time with me, and I'll see you next time.